Welcome to the Commonwealth Club World Affairs of California. I'm Michelle Miao, a member of the Board of Governors and also producer and programmer here. The club is dedicated and has a mission in finding the truth. It's been around for over 120 years. And so if you find yourself really inspired and you love the work that we do, consider becoming a member today. And now let's get our program started tonight. We are going to talk about death. Our author has written the first biography, I believe, on Dr. Thomas Noguchi, and he's the LA coroner to the stars. And so we have this amazing book with us today. If you didn't get a copy, you can get a copy tonight, Thomas Noguchi and Death in Hollywood by Ann Soon Choi, who also is a professor, by the way, at Cal State Northridge and teaches Asian American Studies. Let's give a huge round of applause for that. Yes. And we'll be joined by the wonderful award-winning journalist, author, and activist, Helen Zia. So let's welcome our two speakers to the program tonight, Helen Zia and Soon Choi.
We have a really exciting discussion for you tonight. I love this book. Ann Soon Choi has done an incredible job, and thank you, Third State Books, for publishing Asian American books. And you'll find out in the course of the discussion that I'm not sure another publisher would have published the kind of details and information that Ann has in this book. So we're gonna get right into it. First of all, how many of you have heard of Thomas Noguchi before? Okay, a lot of you, but some not. So we're going to talk about a very controversial, a very prominent Asian American in LA, but was a national figure, and we're going to talk about how that is. And so one of the reasons, it's called LA Coroner, okay? He was the coroner, medical examiner of Los Angeles, a huge, one of the largest cities in America with many celebrities. And you go into a lot of detail about some of the more famous autopsies that he performed. But you give the context of them. He wasn't just Quincy, M.E., the show with Jack Klugman that was based on his character. Jack Klugman, Quincy, was the medical examiner in L.A. After, or during and after the period that Thomas Noguchi was. So maybe let's just start and talk a little bit about who he was, how he came to be, and how you got interested in this man who performed the autopsies of Marilyn Monroe, Robert F. Kennedy, the Sharon Tate, a number of other very famous actors, Natalie Wood. And what you do as a historian is you give the context of each of these. I didn't know what to expect when I picked up Ann's book. I was thinking that, okay, it's going to be all about the, the celebrities. And tell us a little bit about, did you know who Thomas Noguchi was? At what point did you know who he was before you started writing this book? And how long did you spend writing the book?
So sometime it had to be the late 90s or early 2000s, Thomas Noguchi had written a memoir about his famous cases called Coroner. So I guess my title is somewhat derivative, but I had found his book in the mystery bin. If you're familiar with New York City, the Strand bookstore has these bins outside of the store. And I was a graduate student at the time, and I was too poor to buy books inside the store, but I could afford the dollar bin on the outside of the store. And within all the mystery books, because I love mysteries and thrillers, I found the book Coroner. And I was like, Noguchi, I was like, that's like, this guy is, Japanese American. And I was like, well, why have I not heard about him? And so instead of working on my dissertation, like I was doing research at Columbia, so instead of working on what I should have been working on, I took his book and I went to a cafe and then just like sat with it and just, I think I probably read it almost in one, like, you know, and just sitting there and reading and reading and reading. And what really struck me about him is that he was so involved in these cases, but subsequently he disappears from the narrative. And that stuck with me because that is oftentimes the case with Asian American history. And this is a moment where I'll have to fangirl a little bit because of Helen. Like, Helen and I had met when I was either an early assistant professor or a graduate student at the time. And we were talking and she told me, you know, Asian American history is hiding in plain sight if you're looking for it. And that stuck with me, like at the very beginning of my career. And I never forgot that. And I think that in and of itself had such a profound impact on my work, and then particularly for this book. But I had a dissertation to write, and it wasn't about Thomas Noguchi. It was about Wilsonian democracy and Korean immigrants. But see, I'm already boring you with that part. And it was boring to me too, but like I finished it. And so, but I took the book, Corner, and I just carted it around. And as a graduate, I moved and lived in a lot of places, Philadelphia, Lawrence, Kansas, LA. So I just carted this book around. I just couldn't let go of it. And even when I was in a very, you know, my lifestyle was very transient. You know, I would chuck books, whatever, like just enough, whatever I could fit in my car and go. But I hung on to the book. And so in 2017, I had another book project I was working on, but I didn't like that either. So this might be a pattern with me. I didn't like that book, but then I was really drawn back and I reread Corner. And I also could no longer do the kind of research I had done previously where I'd, you know, travel to different countries. And, you know, in 2017, I also had a newborn at home. And I was just like, well, what if I did a local project of some sort? And then, so what I thought was, well, maybe I can do something with Thomas Noguchi. And then I just started, you know, pulling things. And what was, again, amazing about this is all of it was right there. It was buried like in the local archives at the Huntington Library, various Cal State libraries, and it was all there. And most importantly, it was you can reconstitute all of Thomas Noguchi's career like through the press, and not just like the LA Times, but like the Monrovia Press, like all these little newspapers all over Southern California and the Japanese American press covered Thomas Noguchi in great detail.
And so just there, I mean, you start digging in, you had read his book and that intrigued you. But the more you dug, I mean, first he was born in Japan, right? Yes. So he wasn't actually Japanese American. So that distinguished him, not just, it distinguished him in many ways, but also culturally differentiated him from the culture of the community that he came to be in. And he was also very different. He was a complicated man. He was very flamboyant. He didn't mind being out and, you know, saying things in public, sometimes saying outlandish things. So as you dug and started to read more about him, what was it about him that sort of intrigued you to then also want to dig more? And, you know, was it that you wanted to find out who was this guy and how did he even exist and survive?
Yeah. Well, part of it was that he was such a complicated character, like during his time, like as the coroner. And he was also sometimes just so unlikable. And he was like such a jerk sometimes. Like when I read, I'm like, did he really say that? But then he would do something wonderful, right? And so he was a person, like he seemed so human to me. And you could see him struggling, going back and forth. But, you know, and sometimes like his better angels did not win out. But he got right back up and then did, right? Like he would continue on. And I think because he sort of represented the, you know, like so often I think In biographies, okay, so now you're going to know too much. Like in biographies, I don't like. I don't like these kind of very flat renditions of like a person's life. Oh, everything they did was wonderful. That was fantastic. Like, because that fails to capture the very humanness of a person, right? And so he was out there with all his problems, all his failings, and, you know, he just managed to kind of muddle on through. You know, he had good days and bad days, but he owned all of it, and he was really unapologetic about it, and I found that to be really amazing for who he was and in the time that he was working, right? Like, this is the 60s and 70s, and when he starts his career, like, anti-Japanese sentiment is a very real and continues to be a real part of how Asian Americans like move through the world.
It wasn't that long after World War II and the incarceration, the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans from all over the West Coast. And that was also part of the disconnect for him. I mean, he had grown up as a boy in, you know, war-torn Japan and lived through the bombings, everything like that. Goes to medical school, comes here in the 50s. So that's, you know, not even 10 years after World War II. And meanwhile, Japanese Americans are beginning to make their way back to wherever they're going to make home, and with, you know, nothing, because everything was taken from them. And so he had, can you say more about the disconnect? Because one thing you do just masterfully is you put him in the context. You talk about the community, whereas it would have been very, you know, sort of straightforward in those flat biographies, just to sort of, he did this, and then, you know, this happened, and what happened in his personal life, but or his career. But you also give the context of his community.
Yeah, so when he arrives in the 50s, he is just full of optimism, and he comes to the U.S. because he says, like in his memoir, he says that he's dazzled by American science, and he wants to come to the U.S. and be a part of that. And so he comes and he does a second residency, and he doesn't speak English. Like, you know, nothing is easy for him. And he comes to the one hospital that agrees that, okay, well, you can come in and be an intern here. And it's a public hospital in Orange County, and it certainly could not have been easy for him, because oftentimes people, even at a public hospital, would not want to be treated by someone Japanese. And, you know, and Orange County, especially in the 50s, was not hospitable to Asian immigrants, but he managed to do that. But he was also a person, right? He's part of this post-war migration, the Shin-Issei, so the new Japanese immigrants that included students like him. It included war brides, but he was, you know, in terms of his age, generationally, he lined up with the Nisei, who had experienced, right, incarceration during the war. And so he has a very different outlook on, you know, what he thought sort of upward mobility, what race relations, and he didn't have much of a racial consciousness until he marries someone Japanese American. And her family is incarcerated, and she herself has her education at UCLA interrupted because she was incarcerated during the war. And it takes him a minute to, you know, understand, right, that he's not isolated in this context. He's just not moving through as a person from Japan, that he now is part of these racial politics in the US. And it really throws him off balance. And because he thought it was going to be a meritocracy. Like, he was just going to come and work hard, and that's the way that, you know, his career was going to unfold.
Well, it wasn't long after he was just sort of working in the LA coroner's office, and he was not the medical examiner, the chief medical examiner. And somehow, when Marilyn Monroe dies, he is assigned the autopsy. So this sort of catapults him into visibility. And but there had never been a person of color as a medical examiner in that position in Los Angeles then. And he then gets embroiled because he believes in the meritocracy, that he's one of the top, what are they called? Deputy coroners. Yeah. Deputy coroners in LA. And he's fully expecting that if the system really worked fairly, he would become the coroner when his boss retired. But that didn't happen, right? And then there was a community dynamic, which you go into, and I'm not sure that another book on this would have touched this at all. And in fact, you were telling me that some publishers didn't even, they told you just focus on the celebrity autopsies, right?
Yeah, and I really wanted this book about to be about Thomas Noguchi and his story. And if it couldn't be about him, then I didn't want to write the book. And I think that made it difficult for my agent, right? But we were so fortunate that he saw, right, the launching of Third State with both Stephanie and Charles. And I knew within the first 5 minutes of our meeting that this was going to be the home for my project. They knew exactly what I wanted to do. Like, I didn't even have to, I was ready to be in full, I was going to explain why it was significant, why Asian Americans are important, why, right? But I didn't have to say any of that. They just knew.
And truly, that is the difference of having a publisher, editor who understands, the community and our AAP, and is dedicated to telling AAPI stories. I mean, when I first wrote Asian American Dreams and put it out there as a book idea and a proposal, one of the comments I would get back, one was, well, we already have one Asian American book. We don't need another one. It's like, oh, really? In your entire company, you only need one. And another was because I was writing about the community and trying to make it broad. I had stories that dealt with women. I held, women's rights within our AAPI community, about sexual orientation, about the struggle for marriage that was so key within our community, marriage equality. And I was told by one agent, oh, a book about Asian American civil rights and racism, we could publish that, but what's this gay stuff? Get it out. And I mean, you made that decision about not going, and why write a book that you don't really believe in? It isn't telling you giving you the space to tell the story that you want to. And
it's hard enough to write a book that you want to write, right? Let alone write a book that you don't want to do.
How many years did you spend on this book?
This book started as an academic article, and in 2021, I thought I had reached the pinnacle of my career when I won the Francis Wheat Prize. It is the thing in my field as a LA historian. And then I was just kind of done. And I was like, okay, well, now I guess I can retire. I won the prize in my field, and I was really, really happy. But it just kind of took a life of its own, and I just kept coming back to it. And
well, let's talk about your writing process.
Yeah.
And even though you give context to all of these autopsies and his work as a coroner and chief medical examiner, you also talk about some of his autopsies. And I have to say, in another lifetime, I actually did go to medical school, quit after 2 years. But within those 2 years, we did have gross anatomy, and we did do dissections and things like that. You do go into quite a bit of detail, and not out of a sort of a, gory voyeuristic way, but because choices that he made and the way what he found, whether it was the autopsy of Marilyn Monroe or RFK and so forth, they were very significant, and to the story as well as to the country. And so you go into those, and I was thinking, wow, the Sharon Tate and the Manson murders were particularly in detail. And as I was reading them, I was just thinking of you doing this research as a historian. And, you know, the leg bones connected to the thigh bone, and like how many bones are there? And so were you pre-med, like when you were a student? Like, what did you have to do to go through and read these autopsy reports?
I am Asian American of a particular generation, so yes, I was pre-med. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that answer.
So of course, like, yeah, so that's, it wasn't even that, it was this kind of alignment of all the things that, like, I know about and knew how to do, like the archival work, right? Because I'm a historian and I have training in this. And then there were just a lot of other things, like who knew all that time watching Law and Order would like actually help, right? Like I was culturally, when I was writing this book, there is enough out there in popular culture about death investigation that maybe, like, if I had written the book 15 or 20 years ago, I wouldn't have been so conversant already because it's in the cultural milieu, right? Like, so I think that helped. And then I think the other part too, and maybe it's because of me, I don't know if it's because it's tied to being Asian American, but I'm also very good at compartmentalizing. And so like it was the only way to get through some of the really, like, you know, I read through autopsy reports and, you know, listened to, you know, and like a lot of it is really, really horrific. But I think where I could navigate the material is to take clues from Thomas Noguchi, where he was so respectful of the dead. And, you know, he was, you know, always, you know, driven by the science of it. And if I sort of followed that, I could navigate the material without being a voyeur.
You had details that really struck me. I mean, around the autopsy of Robert F. Kennedy. And not only was it about the autopsy itself, it was about when he heard of the shooting, and he was a great admirer of Robert F. Kennedy. And so when he heard of the shooting, he was just horrified by that, just like any other, you know, an American. And then he also had to compartmentalize and sort of think of a process. And this was something I had no idea about, that the John F. Kennedy autopsy and process was considered to be a total mess, and that's why there are so many conspiracy theories today. And that was in his mind, and you go through that, his thought process about it cannot be a mess like what happened with John F. Kennedy. And then he consulted with people about how do we, like, what are the key things that have to happen in order to preserve the science of what needs to be done here. That he had to speak to the family about, you know, because they were like, well, it's obvious this man shot him. He was murdered through this. Why do we need an autopsy? And he said, so that we can identify who actually killed him. And then they, you know, but you go through that, and there was a really, it was so moving where you go through and he sees, you know, the deceased RFK lying there, and he can't proceed, you know, looking at him. So he puts a towel over his face, you know, and then starts conducting the autopsy. But that was considered he did the perfect autopsy, and it was held up, like, I guess, through all of these, you know, whatever coroner, medical examiner conventions or whatever they do, you know? Right? I mean,
they still call it the perfect autopsy. Like, inevitably, like when you look at like some of these forensic science, like, you know, academic conferences, there's someone working on this idea of the perfect autopsy, and Thomas Noguchi is listed, you know, for that, for RFK. And this is really important for his career because, you know, after this huge struggle to become appointed coroner, he is initially put on probation, which had not been
done to anybody else.
Yeah, done to anyone else. And then, but this solidifies his career. Like he goes from, and I know that like, I find this hard to believe because I love LA. Like, LA was kind of considered a backwater for a very long time. And I'm like, really? This is so shocking. But then what had happened, I shouldn't say that here either, I'm sorry. But what I think what happens is that then this vaults him to national prominence. And then all of a sudden, the people who had been so dismissive and disparaging of him here, like, it left very little space for them to.
And they were still dismissive, and they were after him to get rid of him, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it was the medical establishment, the California Medical Association?
They had an LA, the Medical Association, all the medical schools.
UCLA Medical School and USC Medical School, they withdrew any support of him, which was important because a lot of their pathologists did work for him, so they pulled that away from him. The political system also wanted him out, but you cover that, and then you cover how the community responded. And here we started talking about, you mentioned that he was a controversial figure. He didn't really fit in with the Japanese American community, and they thought he was like not he didn't fit in with the other Nisei, but he wasn't a Nisei. So you set up a conflict there, and you talk about the community response. And it was a little bit like, who is this guy? Should we really support him, right?
Yeah. I think part of it was, because he also really liked media attention. He liked being the public face of the coroner's office. And then for a lot of Japanese Americans, like routinely in the Japanese American press, there were always these letters to the editor, opinion pieces that he was so un-Nisei, right? That he was not, like he did not know his place. And so it's really interesting. So he's caught in this situation where Japanese Americans think that he doesn't know his place, but also the white establishment, they say the same thing. And then while I don't have direct evidence for it, but I felt like at a particular point, he was just like, well, if this is my situation, then I'm going to do whatever I want. And he does operate from a space of a lot of confidence and I call him the kind of original influencer. Like he knew how to manipulate and control the media. He knew how to manage the narrative about himself. Like he knew how to generate a soundbite before a soundbite was a thing. And because his career is coming, he is entering sort of the height of his career just as TV is taking off. And he knew, and sometimes I would watch some of the footage, I felt like he would even stop on purpose so it could be a clean cut that they could use. And I'm like, did he really do that? And wow. But he just understood the power of the media in a way that I don't think very many people did. And I think that also contributed, to
the community having mixed feelings.
Mixed feelings because, and rightfully so, I think Japanese Americans who were incarcerated, what they wanted to do was not only come back and build their lives, but they did not want any public attention. And so here's Thomas Noguchi, out in front, and then. But at the same time, he's the highest ranking Japanese American, in the county. So they want to claim that too, but they just wanted him to be better behaved and to be more Japanese American and to follow sort of the conventions of the community, which he was not willing to do. And I think it's that kind of conflict that made him so interesting to write about.
Well, you do a very deep dive into the Japanese American community. I mean, you summarized it right here, right now, but you actually name names, you talk about who he went to first, because he did realize that even though he wasn't a part of the Japanese American community, I mean, he was a Shin Issei, but he knew that it would be helpful to rally community support. And he knew who to go to one by one. And you actually name who these are. We're in San Francisco. The national headquarters for the Japanese American Citizens League is here. But you detail who by name, he went to and how he was able to overcome what objections there were. How are you able to, I mean, first of all, many of the people that you wrote about are still alive. Thomas Noguchi is still alive. He's 98 years old. And so, number one, kudos and congratulations for you to being brave enough to write, this when the subjects are still, still living and they might not agree with, where you were going with this. So I wanted to ask you about that too. But just you yourself, you're Korean American, right? So the getting into that deep dive and connectedness into the Japanese American community, how did you do that?
I think part of it is that I am so appreciative of organizations who kept every single piece of paper, right down to receipts for lunch, everything. And the JACL was fantastic for that. And so literally everything was just in boxes. And I spent months sorting through both at the Japanese American National Library, which is here in San Francisco, and then at the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles. In another case, I had someone just donate boxes to me, wow. They belonged to his father, who was part of the JACL, and I found things there. And then the other part, and Helen and I were talking about this earlier, is that so much of this was laid out in newspapers and the ethnic press. I read every Japanese American newspaper from about 1955 to 1982, and it's all laid out there, and it prompts a great deal of concern on my part. Like, how are people going to write about this time when there aren't newspapers anymore, right? In the same way, every little city and neighborhood had its own newspaper, and at a particular moment, they were all covering Thomas Noguchi. And that those papers were available in historical societies. I spent a lot of time at the Long Beach Historical Society working through their archives, and I read things on microfilm, and that isn't going to be available. And not even records, because everyone just either emails or destroys records now, but they're not available they will not be available in the same way. And I don't think people are going to be able to tell a story like Thomas Noguchi, even though we feel like we know everything about everyone, right? You need this kind of deep archival record to really tell a story.
And so, the gift was that there was this record, but the hard work was sifting through all of it. So in your account of, there were many attempts to get rid of Thomas Noguchi, and one of them was to take him before the Civil Service Board, right? And he had hearings, and it went on for days, right? Weeks or something.
It was the most expensive civil service hearing case,
I think it was millions
of dollars in the 1960s.
But you go through, you summarize it, and I could imagine you having to read through the transcripts of every detail of that and how painful that must have been. But that so you did that too, right?
Yeah.
And so all of this process for you to then cull it together. And I did want to ask you, were there things that surprised you in the course of doing this?
There were a lot of things. I was really surprised, at various points, the LA County Civil Service Association, Employees Association, comes out in full throttle support of Thomas Noguchi. And then, I was so happy. I was like, this is a moment where, right, these white folks are going to come out and critique racism. And it made me so happy, because I thought it was going to be this moment where the narrative was going to be progressive, but it wasn't. It wasn't progressive at all. What they were more concerned was that, hey, these people who are trying to undermine Thomas Noguchi's candidacy, they're bypassing the civil service system, and that's what's important. Mm-hmm. And But I also find that really interesting too, because like later on in Thomas Noguchi's career, he could have gone anywhere. He was so prominent and so well regarded, but he felt so loyal to the county because of the support he had. And it's always very interesting what will align people's interests to exercise a particular sort of political strategy. And then, right, they align, and all 35,000 employees are in support, and the county and the county supervisors are concerned that even though they had agreed tentatively there would be no strike, that they would go out and strike. And so, like, right, it was because of their identity as workers, which I thought was really, they were not racially progressive, but they had a clear sense that they were working people as county employees.
Well, that's another thing I love about your book. You really look at him with a microscope, but you also look at the bigger, broader picture. I mean, you look at non-famous autopsies that he did that had, with, black Angelenos, that then became sort of political issues because he, like the early one with Leonard Deadwyler, who was shot point blank for a traffic sort of driving stop because he was rushing to get his pregnant wife, who was about to give birth, to the hospital. And the police pull him over, and he's trying to, like, my wife's about to have a baby, and they shoot him point blank. And so this became a community issue, which you go into this. But this was early in his career, and he didn't really understand when he was asked, well, this rash that he had, could this have been a drug use? So they tried to blame the victim, and say, well, he was probably a druggie, which was not true. But that was enough to sort of taint, give it like, oh, well, self-defense by the police, right? But you go into that and draw lessons from that. And then later on, there was the Ronald Settles case, where he didn't do the autopsy, but his office did really a bad job, right? Do you want to say a little bit about because you go into just sort of the issues with the black community in LA, and here he is, the Asian face, and I mean, it becomes a sort of a complex,
And in these two cases, Deadwyler and Settles, like, what happens is he also has an encounter with Johnny Cochran before Johnny Cochran is Johnny Cochran in LA, and before his, the O.J. Simpson, trials. And so, but what happens is that for Thomas Noguchi, at least in the Deadwyler case, is that he really thought everything was going to be about science, and because of the scientific evidence and the forensic evidence, like, that would stand on its own, and then that was enough. And he was really, and I think maybe he was naive in the sense that he always thought science would prevail, and it didn't.
Well,
and
I wonder what he thinks about today.
Yes. and so, that he was, that it really shocked him, the racism of it. And, and then this would stay with him as he moved through his career. But I wouldn't say that Thomas Noguchi was a progressive on issues of race, but he did at a time when no one else was critiquing. He oversaw what was called the coroner's inquest, and this was sort of a quasi-judicial process where, there would be witnesses called, they would be under oath, and then it would provide a way for the DA to say, oh yes, this was justifiable. And it used to just be a rubber stamp. The coroner and the DA kind of worked hand in hand, but Thomas Noguchi would not work that way. He maintained the independence of the coroner's office. So oftentimes the inquest would not go in favor of the LAPD or the sheriff's office. And so this set up a huge amount of conflict for him and was a real political liability. And I think that's certainly part of what happens when he's removed, the second time. And particularly with the Settles case, I think it's a combination of things because that was really focused not on a shooting, but the use of the chokehold. And, before Rodney King, right? So the things that we see happen down there are nothing new in LA. And that was, for me, really astonishing about doing research, and really depressing too. And none of this was new. And
right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, your book really gives insight into the whole issue that we talk about today around, policing, systemic racism, all of those topics. And we'd want to save some time for all of you to ask questions, but you spent so much time going into him and his life. You actually met him, right? And you have this wonderful story of how you actually first met him.
Yeah. So I had been trying to get a hold of Thomas Noguchi for several years. So I would, every 6 weeks or so, I would write a letter and have it sent. He has an office at USC still in the Department of Pathology, and he never wrote me back. But I would write and continue to write, and then I just kind of gave up after a while because the manuscript was in progress, and I was like, okay, I'm not gonna. And he had all these people that were constantly deflecting. I think part of it is because he's tied to so many of these famous cases that he has people reaching out all the time. The whole true crime thing. But then I had a really bad year where I had eye surgery. Eye surgery is terrible. 0 stars for eye surgery. I do not recommend it to anybody, but I had 2 very complicated eye surgeries. And then the last eye surgery I had, my husband was there, and I'm really surprised that he even was paying attention because it was football season and all these things. And so he was looking at his phone, waiting for me to come out of surgery. Then he hears someone say Thomas Noguchi was the receptionist. And then he looks up, and Thomas Noguchi is there having an eye procedure. And so with his caretaker. And so I come out, and then I'm in sweatpants. I have a patch over my eye. My eye hurts. I just want to go home. And then my husband's like, Thomas, I was like, I don't care. I don't want to talk about the book. I don't want to, I was like, I don't care. He's like, no, Thomas Noguchi is here. And then, oh my God, it was Thomas Noguchi who was standing right there. And so I'm trying to collect myself, right? And then so here I am, patch over my eye. And so I go over, I introduce myself. I show him the cover of the book on my phone. Oh. I can hardly see, but I was like, but look, and then he's like, that's me. And then his caretakers talk. Then they invited me for coffee. They invited me to his house for coffee. So I go, I'm very excited. I'm texting Charles and Stephanie, look. And then I go, and then I do, and I was prepared to do an interview, and he's 98 and he's frail, and so but we sat in his beautiful garden near Koreatown in Hancock Park, and he also gave me some persimmons to take home. But he had this beautiful garden, and I was just there, the birds and their butterflies, and I'm just sitting there drinking coffee with Thomas Noguchi. It was the strangest experience. And then, but I did have questions, and he did answer, he could answer, very direct things, because, for example, he had gotten divorced from his wife, but I never found, a public record saying that they got remarried. And so I was like, did you get remarried? And his wife had died in 2015. I was like, did you get remarried? Because I knew they were together. He's like, we did get remarried. And he told me the date. And so I was really happy, because I'm also a huge sucker for a good love story. So they got back together. So I was really happy about that. And then, he could answer, a lot of things that would clarify things. And I'm going to see him in 2 weeks, because I'm going to take him a copy of the book. He's been traveling. I guess he went to he's still doing research, so he went to a conference. And so he's busy right now. And he said he could fit me in 2 weeks. I was like, that's fantastic. And so I'm going to take him a copy of the book. But when I went, I was prepared. And then he signed my very battered copy of Coroner, which now has a rubber band around it because I've read it so many times. And I was just really, who knew my husband would be paying attention at that particular moment? And I would have the wherewithal after eye surgery that I was just not a complete disaster. And then I got to meet Thomas Noguchi. It was awesome.
I would like to just ask you, you're a historian, and his career spanned so many things. We touch on, Asian American community stuff, Japanese American more specifically, Black community, Asian. He had support from a number of Black leaders in his cases. The policing, the governmental stuff, and just media and all of that, him and as a personality, not to mention all of the celebrities that he did autopsies on. I'm just wondering, do you draw any lessons from that time that's relevant to where we are today?
Yeah, I think, aside from the bit about the newspapers and how we need just, archives, that's how we're going to save ourselves. But I'm a historian, so I'm kind of biased. So keep that in mind. I think the lesson there is there is power in cross-racial alliances, and you can see that over and over in Thomas Noguchi's career. And it may be a little cliche, right? But people are stronger together when communities band together, and you can see that that was a reality for him. And who knew that? I don't know if this is a takeaway, but who knew county history and the civil service hearing could be so interesting. I did not know. I'm going through these transcripts. I'm like, what's going to happen next? Like some of it was just heart pounding, and but then what it suggested to me, there must be so many stories like this to tell, and other people can do it.
We have a bunch of really great questions. Okay. So I'm going to start with one about that gets into the autopsies of these famous people themselves. And one question is what's a perfect autopsy, but also what are some of the controversies? Yeah. And for that, maybe we should talk about the Natalie Wood.
Yeah, so some of the controversies that he wound up in was because part of it is that he felt that the coroner's office should be politically independent. And this was before, right? This is a time where, the consumption of alcohol, and maybe it still is, less so maybe, but it was very normalized. It was, it was just a part of everyday life. But he was the first to speak out saying, hey, if you drink too much, it can be dangerous. And I know it sounds really common sense, but this was not sort of the worldview in the 70s and 80s. And he offended a lot of people.
Frank Sinatra. That was one of the
best things I found in the archives. I'm working at the Huntington Library, and I'm working in this supervisor's papers. And then I'm just sorting through things. And then there is this super thick, embossed, it's creamy white, and it says Frank Sinatra. And I was like, no. And then I stopped, and then I picked it up again, and I'm looking at it. And then he has this super fine penmanship, and you knew he used a fountain pen, right? And then it was just beautiful. But then apparently there's a subsequent letter attached to it from some administrator. Frank Sinatra was so mad about what Thomas Noguchi said about Natalie Wood drinking, which contributed to her death, that he drove. I think he had a driver probably, but he came to the Board of Super and hand-delivered this letter. He was so angry that something had to be done about Thomas Noguchi. And then he also delivered a very similar letter to the Screen Actors Guild. So the Screen Actors Guild comes out against Thomas Noguchi. And so, but basically, like, he was very much not afraid to say these things. And then lo and behold, last year, wow, drinking alcohol, it's kind of bad for you, right? like he was way ahead of his time, because his belief about the dead was always that any work he did as a forensic pathologist, it had to serve the living. And that was, I think, his compass, and that made things very clear for him. Not so much for other people, but clear for him. And so, yeah.
And there are a few questions about his relationship to the media, performative aspects of what he did with science, whether that also irritated his detractors, and so his prominence in the media. But there was also what you just said, what made things about science clear to him. Sometimes to other people, like families involved or whatever, it would be like he was revealing too much personal stuff about the people that he had performed autopsies on, right? So as far as his relationship to the media, do you think that was one of the things that got people really to want to get rid of him?
Yeah, I think that was certainly a part of it, but at the same time, it was kind of both, right? Like a lot of politicians and the county medical association, they could not keep up with Thomas Noguchi in terms of the way he used the media. And then some of the Board of Supervisors were also a little irritated that Thomas Noguchi got more coverage than they did. And then, so this was this was an issue as well. But I think in terms of the way he uses the media, again, right, it's to stake out his independence. And no corner had ever done this before. Like, it will feel very familiar to us now. And then also in this time, but everything is changing. And then with the way that tabloid journalism kind of explodes in this time period, I mean, tabloid journalism has always existed, but it explodes in kind of new and different ways. And then I think what's very interesting is that it used to be that you could, people wanted to know everything about a celebrity, right? But then it expands in this time. But now you want to know how they died and, what caused their death. You wanted to know, so this is something new. And Thomas Noguchi recognizes this and then uses it to consolidate the power of his office. And I know it's hard for us to understand now, this is pre-TMZ, right? Before you knew every single detail about how someone died, right? The convention was you didn't talk about these things, right? There was a lot of sort of courtesy and things extended to celebrities that we don't see today. None of that exists anymore. And so I think sometimes it's hard for present-day readers to understand, there was this kind of tacit agreement that journalists would not reveal these kinds of details, but here's Thomas Noguchi. But for him, though, it was in the name of science and improving, the life of the living, right?
Well, speaking of that, here's a question. Has this project changed how you think about death?
I'm a middle-aged person, so I do think about death. And also, right, because of my eyes, all COVID, everything. It does and it doesn't, because I think, it did make me think that to be a forensic pathologist or to do death investigation, you actually really can't think about death too much, right? You can't think about your own mortality, because you're encountering everyone else's mortality. But it does make me think about the way that even in this period, when people died, it wasn't driven by dying in hospitals and right, there's much more technology around death now in a way that wasn't apparent in this time period. And then maybe this is just my way of compartmentalizing, and maybe I don't want to think about death at all. So maybe that's part of it. But there is one thing that I do know, and I feel very confident, is that without Thomas Noguchi, you would not have the CSI franchise. And I consider him like, the father of true crime, and that and hopefully with this book, he's restored to that place, because he's, in every one of these cases, he's just a footnote, right? He's just a footnote.
Did he benefit at all from the Quincy program that was based on his life, or, like you're citing the CSI?
Yeah, no, he didn't. He even served as an advisor, but he was not paid for it. He was friends with Jack Klugman, and he never publicly said if he found the Robert Ito character, which was kind of the sidekick, right? There's always the Asian American sidekick, right? And so, he never said whether that was offensive to him or if it was accurate. But he did like being attached to the show because that gave him sort of, it was still part of that celebrity for him. Yeah.
I did have a question, but it just went away. Yeah. We're about time now, but looking at the media interest in this still, do you think, there would be interest in a movie based on your book? I mean, in taking the broader look and not just looking at, the CSI part of it.
I hope so, because his life and still, he's amazing, right? He managed, and not in a way that is sort of part of the standard, that American, rags to riches story. It's not that, and it's also he doesn't fit neatly into kind of Asian American social mobility, that narrative either, where immigrants just everything works out well and you have a fantastic life. He really his story is one of real adversity. And I think the American part of his story is every single time he gets knocked down, and I'm just oh yeah, that's it, right? But he just picks himself back up, and he goes on to the next case, and he continues on. And then when he finally loses his job, in the 80s, I think it's actually good for him. And I think I would even say that to him, it was good for you, because it takes him out of the media spotlight and the media, and I don't want to psychoanalyze Thomas Noguchi, but there was something about the media that fed something in him. And when that was shut off, I felt that he returned to his better nature, and then what he does is he returns to research, and then he teaches and he educates generation after generation of pathologists. And, that he, and then he becomes chief pathologist of County USC. And so, it works out. But it also probably helped that his book was on the New York Times bestsellers list and all these things. While all this is, he co-authors 2 mystery novels. And he has this thriving career as a writer. And I think that must have been really nice, he didn't even have to say, because he drops out of the media. He doesn't say anything except until he retires in 1999, and he's just so gracious. He just says, I've worked for the county for 30 years, and I don't regret a single moment of it. All of it was wonderful, and that's how he retires.
So 2 quick questions before we wrap up, and people can meet you in person, when they get your book and you sign it for them. Are you worried at all? You said you're going to show him the book in 2 weeks. Are you concerned how he might respond to what you wrote about him?
I'm hoping that, and I have a lot of hopes about this, I'm hoping that because he's already been through the ringer with people who said terrible things about him, that I don't think my book will land too badly.
I think that's true. And you give him his context, as a real and full human being. And the other thing is, you're already working on a new project. What is that?
So I have a couple of things, right? I write across genres. I am wrapping up a K-pop horror book. I know that's a YA book, and that's been a whole nother kind of writing. And then I'm wrapping up. Before even Thomas Noguchi happened, like I had been working on a mystery. And my friend Eunice is in the audience, and she's read different parts of it about a Korean American, surprise, LA detective, and hopefully that will find a home someday soon. And but it was my great privilege to work on Thomas Noguchi, and also to work with Third State Press. And then and this book is, as you know, it. Like I was told by someone, it reads really well, and I really have Charles Kim, my editor, to thank for it, because it would probably have 50,000 more words without him. and so anything that is elegant about it is really, you know, Charles's influence on the book. So I'm really grateful, and then all the support that I received from Third State and Charles and Stephanie in particular. So I'm really appreciative.
Thank you.
And so appreciative to be in conversation with you, Helen.
Thank you for writing this amazing book, and thank you for talking about it with us today.
Yeah,
and
this
now
is wonderful.
And thank you all for being here, and especially Commonwealth Club and Third State Books for publishing this amazing book. It does read well. I couldn't put it down. It's really a wonderful book with many surprises. So thank you again.
Thank you.